Hey guys, welcome to Look 7. Today, this is what we're making. Wide leg pants and an organza jacket. Okay, so for SEO purposes, I'm going to have to put up this video in two different parts. Today, we're going to make the pants, and in my next video by Wednesday, we are going to make the jacket. If you like my bralette, there will be a link in the description box to buy it if you want it. It's a stretchy, netty lace fabric. The back is also made of lace and see-through. There's just going to be a link to a conga shop that you can buy it from in the description box. Make sure you subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and give this video a thumbs up, and let's get started.
So I once shared a video on here about making patterns from my existing clothes, and for the pants, I took it apart. I copied the pieces onto paper, the back first and then the front. I copied the fly and shield information as well, and this pattern already included seam allowance, and now they look like this. So today we're going to manipulate that to actually make the wide leg pants. What I did first was to lengthen it at the side seam to 48 inches, knowing that I was adding an extra 2 inches of seam allowance, knowing that my band, which I would add much later, would be 1.5 inches. After lengthening it, I moved on to the crotch and I squared it down. This is basically what makes it wide-legged. It's not fitted at the legs, so right from the crotch and also right from the hip. So I did the same thing with my front pattern. The first was my back pattern. I lengthened it to 48 inches inclusive of seam allowance, and I squared it down at the crotch and also at the hip. Whenever I make pants, and this should be a general guideline, I like to compare the side seams on the front and the back to make sure that they are approximately the same length, and also the inseam as well. So this is what I'm doing right here, comparing for the front and the back. You would see me measure, I would see what it comes to, and then I would measure it on the back. If it doesn't, then I know I have to adjust something. But if this has been well drafted, they should very well come to the same length. To make my inseam pocket, I put my front pattern on another scrap of paper, measured 2.5 inches down from the waist, and I marked that point. And what I did was to trace the side seam onto that paper. Then I measured 6 inches. This would be the length of the opening of my inseam pocket. So what I did was to then draw a pouchy pockety pattern here. You can make it as pouchy as you want it to be. Next thing I did was to smoothen these lines and add seam allowance of 1 centimeter, and to cut it out so that I had it looking like this. I cut 2 pairs this pattern, and I will get around to using them much later in this video. So my back pattern looking like this, legs wide, I cut out a pair, that's 2 pieces. Also picked up my front pattern, I cut out 2 pieces, and also my fly and my shield, which if you watch that video you would see that I also copied these patterns. So let's move on to sewing. First thing I did was to bind the side of the fly. I moved on to the shield. I folded it in half across the length, and I stitched the bottom so that it looks like this. What I would do next is to measure the length, which for me came to 6.5 inches. But I measured 6 inches at the center front of the pants, and from here I'm going to stitch the 2 front pieces together, but I would also not sew it all the way to the end. I would stop about 1 inch to the end of the pattern, just to ensure that I have space to still stitch together my crotch in the end. Now I would pick up this fly and I would sew it to the seam allowance. It has to go past the stitch I just made that holds the actual front pieces together. Then I would go on to understitch it. As you can see, I've sewn this on a sewing allowance that's less than the sewing allowance that I used to put my pants together. This is going to be essential so that these pants can fall on top of themselves. So to the other side, I would stitch on my zipper. Just make a straight stitch all the way down. I guess you can make your zipper face whatever side that you want it to. Right after stitching this, then I would move on to place the shield under this zipper. I would pin them together and I would now top stitch right next to the teeth of the zipper on this right side all the way down. If you have a zipper sewing foot, good for you, but you don't absolutely need one. Now it looks like this. Next thing I would do is to flip this over the zipper, pin it down at the outside, and I would stitch this fly to this side of the zipper, the left side of the zipper. So I would run a straight stitch all the way down as well. Next up is to measure 1 inch. I like to just keep it at 1 inch. 1 inch from the top to the bottom, and you're going to pay attention to where the seam on the center front starts. Yeah, that point. And that is where the top stitching would taper to. I would go ahead and put this together with the fly. Try and do your best not to stitch the shield as well, otherwise the pants would never open. So I would just go on to make this top stitch and to taper it down to where the seam of the pants actually began. Now it's looking like this. You want to cut off whatever excess you have in your zipper, and you want to put the fly and shield together on the wrong side and just stitch them together. I moved on to my back where I had already stitched the two pieces together. Now for my pocket, I measured 2.5 inches down as planned, but then I remembered that the seam allowance I put in my pocket pattern was 1 centimeter, so I went up by 1 centimeter again and I stitched it down onto the pants. Once you're done, you want to press the pocket such that the seam allowance faces the pocket. Now I'm going to go ahead to top stitch this seam allowance down on the pocket side. This is called understitching. There's going to be a lot of understitching in this tutorial today. I did that on the front as well, the front pants. Now it's time to stitch very carefully from the top across the pocket and all the way down. Once I've done that, I would move on to the inseams, put the legs together at the inseams and run a stitch all the way down. And once that is done as well, I would stitch the crotch together as I kept promising, and I kept leaving seam allowance to make room for that. So after I did that, the next step was to hem these pants. Remember, I added a 2-inch hemming allowance to these pants. So I measured 2 inches. I was able to fold it like this, and I folded 1 inch further inside. I turned my pants in that way, and I used my blind hem foot to make a blind hem stitch. I used to have a video on this, but I later privated it when I saw that my eyelash in the introduction was falling off. But maybe I'll make another video. Or maybe I would get over myself and release that video to the public. Okay, next thing you want to do here is to measure the waist circumference. I like to measure this all over again, because at this point I've now added the shield and the fly, and I'm not quite sure what the length would be until I have measured it. So this came down to 26.5 inches. So what I did was to measure half of 26.5 inches, which is 13.25 inch. I added half an inch of seam allowance, and then I measured 2.5 inches up because I wanted my band to end up at 1.5 inches. So I also drew a straight line there and I cut it out. I also cut this on fold and I fused interfacing to one. You can totally fuse interfacing to the both of them, really. I went on to put these two together to run a straight stitch up. I would press such that the seam allowance was facing the interface side, and if you've interfaced both, just press such that the seam allowance is facing one side. This will make sense later. I would stitch down on top of that seam allowance, the other side all the way down. And this is a close shot. I thought to zoom in. I hope that this helps to see better what I've been doing. Yeah, so I would just stitch all the way down. I bias binded the interface side as well. What I would do next is to fold the non-interface side over the interface side, sew on a 1/2 inch seam allowance that we added, but I would not sew to the end. I would leave a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I would cut off the excess so that I am able to turn this inside out and not have to deal with the bulk. Right, I did on both sides of this band, and now it was time to stitch it to the top of my pants. I would put the seam allowance onto the waist of the pants, and I would just stitch it all the way from the beginning to the end. And right after doing that, I would fold in the bias edge just a tiny little bit, just the edge, not the entire length. I would just fold the edge a little bit, and I would stitch in the ditch. In stitching in the ditch, we try to drop the needle at the intersection, at the crack of the seam between the band and the body of the pants. And I honestly don't know how else to explain that, but I have zoomed in to try to ensure that it's a bit clearer. You just stitch as close to that crack as possible. You actually drop your needle in that crack, and you just stitch all the way to the end. As soon as this is done, I went on to fix my button and also to sew on my buttonhole. There will be more pictures on Instagram. Make sure that you follow me on there to see the gorgeous pictures that I took with this outfit. Thank you so much for watching today. I'll see you in my next one. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like this video to support me. Yeah, and also to see similar content in the future. I'll see you in my next one. Bye.